I'm super excited to have this opportunity to talk to you guys today about web components. I think it is a crazy new technology that's going to completely change the way that we build applications on the web. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank Anne and everybody who put together this conference. So it is, I can imagine it is a ton of work putting on something this size, and they've done a really wonderful job. It's awesome that we have this really awesome space. And I want to thank you guys too. There's some other really cool talks going on during this moment, so thank you guys for being here with me today to talk about this. Just to introduce myself, my name is Rob Dodson. I'm a freelance front-end developer. I blog at robdodson.me. I'm on Twitter and GitHub. We're going to cover a ton of material today. I hope that there's enough time for Q&A at the end, but if there isn't, be sure to reach out to me on one of those sites and we can keep the conversation going. So we've got a lot to cover this afternoon or this morning. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about just what are web components? What does that term mean? And what does the whole component model of the web really mean? We're going to take a look at all the specs that collectively make up web components. There isn't really one web component technology. It's actually about 4 technologies that we use in tandem. And then lastly, time permitting, we're going to look at some ways that you can actually use web components today, not necessarily in production, unless you like to live dangerously, but definitely in side projects and in experiments and sketches. And I think it's really important to start using these things now, not only to give feedback to the folks at Google and Mozilla who are building them, but also so you can kind of imagine how your current code base could dovetail into this new technology. Fair warning to everybody in the audience, there's going to be a lot of code in this talk, and it might mess with your head a little bit. Some of what we're going to talk about is actually going to really mess with the bedrock of web design, so you might feel like this at times. But I feel that by the end of here, at the end of this talk, you're all going to leave here feeling pretty stoked and pretty excited about where all this is headed. I really think this is going to change the way that we do our jobs, and it's going to hopefully make all of our lives a lot easier. And I'd like to start off by asking a kind of rhetorical question of the audience. And I really want to know, how do you guys use Bootstrap? And it's okay if you don't use Bootstrap, Twitter Bootstrap. This is just sort of like a little thought experiment. It could be, how do you use Foundation? How do you use Kendo UI? How do you use jQuery UI or jQuery plugins? Really what I'm interested in is, how do you use all of the libraries and the widgets and the third-party code that you use to build your applications? And I have a little narrative that I kind of want to work through, and I feel like maybe it kind of gets to the heart of a big problem that we're dealing with all the time. So if you're like me and you want to use something like Bootstrap, the first thing you do is you go to the documentation for Bootstrap, and you're like, maybe I want a nav bar. And you go and you find the nav bar in the docs, and then you just copy all of this code, right? And this is the code for the Bootstrap nav bar. I didn't dress this up. I took this right out of the docs. And you go in and maybe you change a couple lines because you only actually care about 3 links in there. And then you get your widget, right? But you never want one widget. So maybe you got to go back and you're like, yeah, I kind of like that carousel. All right, let me get the carousel. Oh, that's a lot more code that's got to go into my app. And so on and so on and so on. You kind of just go back and forth till you've filled your application with all of this funky boilerplate that you yourself did not write. So it's kind of easy to break it, right? You're just sort of copy and pasting stuff, and if you forget a line in here, or maybe you screw up the CSS a little bit, then the whole thing is just screwed. I think we can do a lot better than that. I feel like that is sort of the Ikea approach to building web applications, and it's how we've been doing things for a really long time. And it's just you get all these parts and you've got to kind of assemble them yourself, and maybe there's leftover bits and you're like, I don't really know what those bits do, but I hope I don't need them. And you just do that over and over again. I think instead of copy all the things, it should just be use the thing. If I want a Twitter Bootstrap navbar, I should just be able to say, okay, I want this Bootstrap navbar tag, and the only code I'm going to write, the only code that's going to go in here is the code that is pertinent to my application. Like the links for my site, which is about bacon, I guess. So that's what we're talking about today. That's what web components kind of like get at. That notion of, I don't need to know how everything is being built. I don't need to know the internals of everything. I just care about the bits that are relevant to my application. So as I mentioned earlier, there's no one web component technology. It's actually a collection of technologies, and when we use them together, like Voltron, they become this amazing thing. So first, they give us the ability to create our own HTML elements, which is awesome. That's kind of what I was showing before with that Bootstrap tag. Next, they give us the ability to encapsulate our CSS styles. So if you make a component and you put some CSS inside of it, you are guaranteed that that component is going to render exactly as you intend it to, which is pretty amazing. Yay! Right? And lastly, we get this whole suite of lifecycle callbacks that we can use with our components to react to changes. So when a new instance of our component is created, when it is added to the document or removed, when someone manipulates an attribute on it, we have these callbacks that we can use to respond to those changes and re-render our component or dispatch an event or load in more data. So from a high level, I think these are kind of like the really awesome selling points of web components. But the most important thing to keep in mind is that under the hood, web components are using all the same tools that the browser makers use when they implement their own tags. So when the Chrome team or the Firefox team implements the video tag or the text area tag, all of the APIs, all the syntax that they use is now being exposed to us. So we can make our own tags that work just like theirs, and that means that it is only a really short hop to go from very successful web component to new standard in the browser. And that's really important because we're dealing with this feedback loop right now, this standardization process that takes years, maybe. Like the video tag was proposed in 2007. It's 2013, and I think there's probably still a number of us in the audience who don't really use the video tag because it's like, oh, that's future technology. Like, that is not for my browser. And we have to close that gap. If we're competing with iOS and we're competing with Android in the mobile space, and those libraries already have these wonderful collections of components that they can just kind of bolt together like Legos to build really advanced stuff. We're trying to build apps in that same space, and we've got to just like reinvent the wheel every time, right? We've got to copy all this code and just like chuck it in there. I don't think that works very well. So let me give you another example of kind of the things that we can build with web components. If you're working in DataViz right now and you want to make a pie chart show up, you have to go find some library, and you have to load it into your document, you have to instantiate it, configure it, maybe you need to call some methods on it, pass it some data, you got to figure out where in the DOM it's going to render. It would be cool if we had a pie chart tag, right? And maybe we could configure it with some attributes, and then wherever we want it in the document, voila, we get a pie chart, right? And so this right here is kind of like what you can do with web components. Show of hands, how many of you have worked with or heard of Markdown? Fair number of you? Okay. So for those of you who haven't, Markdown is basically, it's a little language, and it's really popular on like GitHub and Stack Overflow. And when you're using Markdown, you can kind of write some text, and then you can put special little symbols next to it, and that will turn things into like headers and links and stuff like that. It's kind of like wiki syntax if you've used Wikipedia. So it would be cool if you could have a Markdown tag inside of your page, right? And then you wouldn't even necessarily have to write all of the markup inside of your page. You could just write everything in Markdown. Or if you wanted to create a components widget of some kind, so, or sorry, a comments widget of some kind, so you want to allow users to write comments in Markdown, instead of having to know like, okay, I got to go in there and I got to get their comment, and I got to take it over to JavaScript, I got to render it, and then I got to like put it back in the box when they preview. You could just say, all right, so long as the user like writes in Markdown inside of here, it's just going to render. And I don't need to know how Markdown gets parsed. I don't care. It's just going to happen for me. And that's really awesome. I'm just working with the interface of this component now, and that's really awesome. That takes a lot of cognitive burden off of me. So I may have mentioned this before, I'm not sure, but web components themselves, there's kind of like this umbrella effect, because it's not one technology, it's all these other ones, and each of them by their own is really cool and really unique, but when you combine them together, you get something really powerful. So we're going to go over all of the technologies that make up the web component model. The first is templates, and templates are how you scaffold out your element. And they are kind of like the skeleton for your element. If you've worked with Mustache or Handlebars before, it should feel familiar. And then there's Shadow DOM. Shadow DOM is how you encapsulate your element. It's how you decide which bits are going to be public and private. And it also sounds really cool to say. You sound really smart when you say it in a meeting. You're like, I think we should use Shadow DOM. And then people are like, well, we should. There's also custom elements. Custom elements are how you extend the browser. They are custom HTML elements. So the chart py tag that I was showing, the markdown tag, the bootstrap tag, those are custom HTML elements. And finally, you've got imports. Imports are just how we package all this stuff up and we load it into our app or we share it with others. The same way that you import like CSS or JavaScript, you import custom elements and web components. Now, I have this equation here which should help provide some context for everything. So to frame everything, just think that templates plus Shadow DOM equals custom elements. And then imports just loads everything on the page. So you got a template, you put it in the Shadow DOM so it's nice and in this little protected bubble, and then you give it its own tag, and then you load it all with imports. So let's start by looking at templates. And we're going to get into some codes here, so hang in there with me. So templates are inner chunks of DOM that we can reuse throughout the page. And if you don't know what that means, basically it just means it's bits of HTML that we can reuse throughout the document. Now, working with a template is fairly straightforward. It has its own tag now as part of the new like HTML5 language. So it's got its own tag. Inside you can put whatever you want. You can put paragraphs. You can put really any valid HTML. You can put SVG or canvas. You can put an image tag in there, and you don't have to define a source for that image tag if you don't want. You can leave it undefined, and then you can go inside of your template and give that image tag a source at runtime. So this is like totally valid. This is cool. If you do decide to give it a source, the HTTP request for that source is not going to be made until the template goes live. So it really is inert. Everything in there is just kind of chilling out. If you have script blocks inside of your template, then the script is not going to run until the template goes live. So you're not seeing alerts right now or anything. Now, the template tag itself adds a new keyword to our dictionary that we kind of have to keep in our head, and that is the content keyword. That is how you access the internals of the template. You can also access it using inner HTML, but I think that content's a little bit nicer. And a cool thing to know about the template is that anything that goes inside of the template is protected from like external JavaScript on the page. So if someone's using jQuery to look for every paragraph in the document, they probably don't want the paragraph in our template, because that's kind of like a dummy paragraph waiting for some real content. So the template tag and the content keyword, they basically keep external JavaScript out until someone knows to ask for the internals by name. Using a template is pretty straightforward. Here we've got the same template from our previous slide. And to use it, we just use document query selector to query it. We can use the content keyword to actually query inside of the content and give a source to that image tag. And lastly, we can append everything to the body using append child. And then we can call content clone node. And when we pass it true like that, clone node is going to do a deep copy of everything inside of the template and make sure that it serves it up for us. So if we run this, let's see, we should see our script block goes live. And the request for our image gets made. And see it, and then there's paragraph content down there as well. And a adorable corgi. So there's some gotchas when you're working with templates, just some things to keep in mind. There's no built-in data interpolation. So if you're used to other template libraries, you can usually have like a JSON or a JavaScript object full of data on the page. And then in your template, you can have like curly brace tags, and it will just sort of magically map the values from that data object into your template. The native template does not support this, because the browser makers, I assume, kind of wanted all of us to figure out how we want our data moved around. Now, I say it doesn't support it yet because there's already libraries that are adding this support to the template tag. So it's there. It's just not native. The next thing to know is that templates, when they are nested inside of one another and you take the parent and you make it go live, that child does not suddenly become active. So if you've got a template inside of another template, what you've got to do is you've actually got to query inside of the parent to find the child, and you've got to add each to the document separately. Browser support for template is fairly good. It works in current version of Chrome and mobile Chrome, works in Firefox, it works in Opera and Opera Mini. It does not work in Internet Explorer or mobile Safari. I believe Microsoft co-authored the spec on template, but they also tweeted recently that they have no current plans to implement web components. So I have no idea what they're doing. But that's okay. By the way, I'm going to show a lot of browser support charts. Don't let that bum you out, because towards the end we're going to show some libraries that you can use so you can actually start like playing around with these things in all browsers, including Internet Explorer, including Safari, mobile Safari, etc. So that's templates. That's a quarter of the way through. Let's talk about Shadow DOM. Okay, Shadow DOM is a huge topic. We don't have enough time to cover it in this talk. It is going to like blow your mind, and you might feel like your eyeballs are about to explode. That's okay. That's normal. I think when you start to learn about it, though, and you kind of recover from the shock, you're like, oh my god, this is so amazing. This is so cool. So in a nutshell, Shadow DOM provides style and markup encapsulation. It basically lets us take some HTML and some CSS and we can put it in this little protected bubble, and we can decide which parts can be public and which parts will be private. The really cool thing is that it's the same technology used by browser makers when they implement their own tags, like the video tag or the text area tag or the input tag. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about here, let's see if I can share my screen really quick. Got to get into the dev tools. So we are going to mirror these guys. Okay. Make that a normal size. Okay. So this is a video tag. And to use a video tag, you just have this kind of one line of HTML at the bottom, right? And there's a lot of stuff that you get for free from that one tag. You get, you know, the video player, but you also get this play button and this cool scrubber and this time code and all this other stuff. All these things that you did not have to write markup for, right? So if you open the dev tools and you embiggen them, can you guys see that kind of way in the back, sort of? I think I can make them a little bit bigger, but let's see. All right, gigantic. All right. Now, if you open the dev tools and you go over there to this gear, this is a crazy demo to do. There we go. Go over there to this gear, and you scroll all the way down to show Shadow DOM, which is in here somewhere, right there. Show Shadow DOM, and you turn that guy on. Then you can actually open up the video tag, and you can see that there's all this stuff inside of it. There's this weird document fragment, and there's this div. And you can go inside of there, and you're like, hey, wait, whoa, there's like all this stuff in here. And you can find the input for your play button, the range slider, right? Here is all that stuff that I did not write markup for that I got for free. So the browser makers are already implementing tags using Shadow DOM. They already have access to this like secret sandbox world where they can hide HTML and CSS. And what's amazing is now they're going to give that to us, so we can start doing that. So we can start creating our own like video players and audio players and everything, and have it be just like one line of HTML that's configurable, and that's really awesome. So there's some terms to know when you're working with the Shadow DOM. The first is that the guy that's going to hold the Shadow DOM party, the video tag itself, or whatever tag you're defining you're going to fill with Shadow DOM, that's called the shadow host. Okay? And then, yeah, this part's going to be a little funny. So, and then the first child of the shadow host is referred to as the shadow root. And it is the first element in the Shadow DOM that can hold any content. Now, all of these children inside of here are called shadow nodes. And this whole thing is called a shadow tree. And collectively, it is protected by the shadow boundary. Okay? So now you know all the important terminology to work with the Shadow DOM. And just to sort of like reaffirm that. So the shadow host is the tag holding all the Shadow DOM. The shadow root is the first element inside of the Shadow DOM that can actually contain content. It is that grayed out document fragment that we'll be seeing more of. And lastly, the whole thing is protected by this force field called the shadow boundary. Yes, very creative. If you say shadow in front of everything, you're probably right. To create your own Shadow DOM is actually pretty straightforward. Every element now has a new method called createShadowRoot. When you call this, it's just going to return a ShadowRoot object to you, and you can start adding things to it. So here's an example of a bit of Shadow DOM. So up there at the top, we've got a div, and it's called widget. It's actually this little dashed area down below. This is going to be our little shadow DOM thing that we're going to build. And all we have to do is select that widget, and then we tell it to create some shadow root using the create shadow root method. And then with the shadow root object that is returned, we can just set the inner HTML to like a string of HTML. If I run this, then it's going to change the content inside of my widget. And if I go and inspect it, let's see, there's that grayed out document fragment. There's our shadow root. And then there's the new content that we created. Now, it's important to note that the original content has not gone away. Hello world is still there, right? Like the content that was up here in our original div, it's not gone away. It's still there in the document, but it's no longer being rendered. And that's a really important thing to note. So only descendants of the shadow root end up being rendered. So keep that in your head. And you're definitely going to want to take content out of the shadow host and put it into the shadow root, and we'll talk about how to do that a little bit later. But for now, just know that only descendants of the shadow root end up being rendered. So I mentioned that you can do CSS encapsulation when you're working with Shadow DOM. I hope this is like worth the price of admission right here. So to do that, you can take a template. Like you can put whatever you want into the Shadow DOM. So templates work very well with Shadow DOM. So you can take a template. Inside of that template, you can put a style tag. In that style tag, you can say, hey, I think that all H3s should be text color white with a background of tomato. And then I'll have a shadow H3 header. And I'm going to take all this and I'm going to put it inside of that widget Shadow DOM. So there's the JavaScript to do that. It's very similar to what we covered before. And when we do this, it's really interesting because you can see down there at the bottom, our widget now has an H3 inside of it. The color is white. The background is tomato. But above it is an H3 that's just like from the rest of the presentation. And they look totally different. And the two are not affecting one another, right? So that's pretty awesome. There's some cool things that you can do, some additional flags that you can set that will let you coerce the behavior a bit. One of them is that you can tell the shadow DOM, or the shadow root, sorry, that you would like to apply author styles. And this basically allows the user to directly style things inside of your shadow DOM. So by default, this is set to false, but if you set it to true, then our shadow header is going to start to look exactly like the H3 header from the rest of our document. It's just going to have its special styles that we added for color and background. But it starts using the same typeface and it starts using the same margining as the original element. Another thing that you can do with your shadow root is that you can reset style inheritance. So this is kind of like a super CSS reset inside of the shadow DOM. And it basically says, hey, anything that would be inherited by me, I would like to just not do that. I want to go all the way back to the browser defaults. So you can see right now that our shadow header, the color and the background are different from, and the typeface are different from our H3 header, but it's not exactly the browser default right now, right? Like it's, for instance, it's centered because it's inside of an element that is text-align center. So it has inherited that. And the typeface, though it is not the same typeface for headers, is the same typeface that the body uses. It's inherited the body typeface. So if we reset style inheritance, we're going to turn all of that off. And we're going to say, no, 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 no. Like no inheritance at all is going to take place inside of here. And so it's going to reset our H3 so it goes all the way back to the browser defaults. And it becomes this like little times bold thing. So this is some interesting tags that let you do really big sweeping changes with the shadow DOM. But if you want to have more granular control, there is a new attribute called part. And you can use part to kind of poke holes in the shadow boundary to let the user reach in and style just specific pieces inside of your component. So styling with part looks like this. Up there at the top we have some shadow DOM, and we have an H3 and a paragraph, and each of them has this new part attribute. And we give a part a unique name. And it can be any name that you want. It could be foo, it could be, you know, wizards, whatever. If you have wizards in your shadow DOM. And here we're just going to call the H3 heading, and we're going to call the paragraph article. And then in the parent document, we can say, hey, okay, I want to style this widget, and I know inside that the author has exposed some elements for me to style. So I use this pseudo selector for part, and I give it the name of the thing that I want to style, and I can say, okay, I want the font family to be in Courier, And I want the font style for the article to be italicized. So that way you can kind of expose a bit of an API to anyone who's using your component. You can say, okay, bits and pieces you can reach in and style, but otherwise I'll take care of it. I mentioned before that when you're working with the shadow root and the shadow host, that only the content inside of the shadow root ends up being rendered. So of course you want to pull in content from the shadow host, but how do you do that? So you do that with insertion points. And insertion points use this new tag called content to basically suck in stuff from the shadow host. So in this example, we've got a template that we're going to put into the shadow DOM. And we've got an H2 in there, and we just say a wild content appeared. And in our shadow host, we say Jigglypuff. And so what this gives us is a wild Jigglypuff appeared. The content tag has said, hey, anything you got in the shadow host, just place it where this content tag is. Now the content tag, when used by itself, is kind of a crazy catch-all. It will take everything from the shadow host. So if you had hundreds of lines of HTML inside of that widget div, it would take all of them and put them into the shadow DOM, which you might not want. You might want to be more selective and granular about what you invite into the shadow DOM party. So the content tag has its own attribute called select, which uses CSS selectors, and that lets you specify which bits and pieces you would like to take from the host and place into the shadow DOM. And that looks like this. Up there at the top, I've got a couple of headers. And the first one is last name, content select any element with a class of last name. And then first name, content select anything with first name. And lastly, we have a content select, and it's just kind of like empty quotes. And that is like a wild card. That's like anything that you got left over, throw it in here. And then down there at the bottom is the source for our shadow host. And we've got hello world, first name is Rob, last name is Dodson. But what renders is completely reversed because of the way that I structured my content selects and my insertion points. So this is really cool. It means that someone could use one of our components and they might not even, I mean, they don't even have to put things in the right order if they just use the right classes that we expose to them or the right attributes, whatever sort of CSS thing we want to use to select. And it means that they could swap from component A to component B if maybe they're in the same suite of components, maybe it's all from the same author or something, and completely change the way that their widget is rendering without touching any of their source at all, without rearranging their source at all. It would just like happen for them. And that's crazy. So Eric Beidelman from Google and the Chrome dev team, who's been a really good evangelist for web components, has put together this really cool visualizer that you guys can check out. I'll put the slides up later so everyone can find the link. But it basically lets you write shadow host and shadow DOM code side by side, and then you can see where all the different nodes would end up. Because content selection and insertion points is like kind of like really weird in your head when you first start doing it. You're like, and after a while you get totally accustomed to it, but definitely as a learning tool, this is a wonderful thing that you can play around with to sort of figure out where everything ends up. Okay, so browser support for Shadow DOM, not so good. It could be better. It works in Chrome and mobile Chrome. It works in Opera, you know, because it's like a fork of Blink. It's in development in Firefox. Like you can follow the thread. They're, you know, getting there. Internet Explorer, Safari. But don't worry, because we're going to look at some tools at the end that'll let us use this in all browsers. So that was Shadow DOM. Let's talk about custom elements. And this is where I think it gets really cool. So custom elements are new tags that extend the browser. And if you remember this equation from before, templates plus Shadow DOM equals custom elements. So that's kind of what we're talking about now. So you know how templates work. And you know that you can take a template, you can put it in the Shadow DOM. And now we're going to define our own tag for that. So creating your own tag is really easy. The document object has a new method called register. And when you call document register, you pass in a tag name and you pass in a prototype for your new element. The tag name has to have a dash in it. That signifies to the parser that what it's working with is a custom element. And the prototype must inherit from HTML element. But those are really the two only requirements. So to give you an example of how that works, here we got a template. And you can imagine that I have a template somewhere with lots of content in it. I excluded it for brevity here. And then you create a prototype. And that prototype needs to inherit from HTML element. So we use object create to extend HTML element. And in our prototype, we're going to add this special callback. And we'll talk more about what these callbacks do later. But for now, just know we're going to add this special callback called created callback. And we can use this as sort of a constructor. When the parser hits our new tag, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, do you have a created callback? You do. Awesome. I'm going to run that. So it's going to run this for us. And here we can create some shadow root inside of our element. And we can take that template and drop it into our element, into the shadow root for our element. And finally, we call document register. And we register a new tag name of my widget. And we pass in the prototype that we've been building up here. And that's going to return a constructor to us, which we can choose to expose to the user if we would like to, or we can just drop it on the floor if we don't want to. So the 3 ways to use our element after we've registered it. We can use the new tag that we gave it its name, myWidget. We can call document create element the same way that we call document create element div or image. Or we can, if the constructor has been exposed, we can call that constructor, the document register return to us. Now, I showed this created callback, but I didn't really explain it that well. It's basically every custom element has these lifecycle callbacks. They all have these. You can choose to implement them or not. They're going to get run either way. Created callback is like your constructor. It's pretty common to do all of your setup there. Entered view callback. Anytime one of our elements enters the document, so someone creates it maybe entirely in JavaScript and then adds it to the page, entered view callback is going to run. This was previously named entered document callback. So if you go and you find like blog posts that refer to this as entered document callback, you just ignore those because the syntax is deprecated and it's being removed. Left view callback, whenever our element gets pulled out of the document, this is a good place to do some cleanup work. This was also previously named left document callback, and that is also being renamed to left view callback. And finally, the attribute changed callback. And this one's really cool. So anytime anyone changes an attribute on our element, this callback is going to run, and we're going to get the name of the attribute that was changed, the old value, and the new value, which is super great if you want to like re-render your component, or this is kind of your mutation observer of sorts. You can see, hey, what changed on me, and I'm going to like respond in a certain way. Now, aside from defining your own tags, you can also extend pre-existing tags. So if you want to extend the button tag or the form tag, and you might prefer to see that visually like in your document, like instead of a login form tag, you might prefer to see a tag that's like form is login form or something like that. So to do that, we use type extension elements. When you're creating a type extension element, it's basically the same as when you create a regular custom element. You still call document register. You still need to pass in a tag name. You need to pass in an additional option called extends, and that specifies which element you're inheriting from or you're extending. And then your prototype needs to also extend the prototype for that element. So HTML div element, HTML image element, HTML button element, whichever prototype you want to extend. And that's kind of cool because then you inherit some of the behaviors and methods of that, that element, and you don't have to rewrite them yourselves. So adding a type extension element to the page is pretty straightforward. You use the original tag. So here, since we're extending button, we have a button tag. And then you use this is attribute to say button is my button, or whatever name you registered. You can also call document create element. And when you call document create element, you pass in the original tag name and the new tag name. Or if the constructor was exposed from document register, then you can just call that and add that to the page. Now, if you go on the internet right now and you look up web components, you look up custom elements, almost certainly you will find blog posts that show how you can create an element declaratively using an element tag like this. And it's really cool, and I really would like for it to come back, but for now it's being removed, so don't use it. Ignore any of those blog posts that use that, because it's not going to work. The Mozilla developers and the Chrome developers are kind of working out, when imports in JavaScript should happen versus when elements get registered, and there's just all this back and forth, and they've decided for now not to do it declaratively. So the only way to create a custom element moving forward is the JavaScript approach that I was showing before. Oh, and there's a link in the notes to the actual thread if you want to read the discussion about like all the problems that they were running into. Okay, that's a lot of code, a lot of talking. Let's look at some cool stuff. What can we build with custom elements? Like what what could we imagine, what would save us a lot of time and a lot of effort? So I have a newsletter on my site, which you should all go sign up for. And I use MailChimp for my newsletter. And if you've ever used MailChimp, it's a lot like when you use their service, they give you a whole bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you're supposed to just like drop on your page. And I don't really like the idea of having that like all over my document. Their CSS doesn't look like my CSS. They use underscores instead of dashes, which is crazy. So I was like, can I just turn all this MailChimp stuff into its own tag? And so that's what I did. And so I have this MailChimp signup tag. And you can configure it with attributes. And yes, the API for those attributes, like, it's a little ugly, but it's because it wasn't intended to be used that way. But I've taken all of that code, and it's a lot of code. And I just have this one-liner now. So there you go, functioning MailChimp tag. Do any of you build dashboards or do data visualization? Wouldn't it be really rad to be able to do that with just like tags and not have to write any JavaScript? Perhaps the only JavaScript you would need to write is the stuff that you kind of care about, like pulling the data off the server and just getting it into the tag. So I took chart.js and I converted all of it to custom elements, and you just configure them with a values attribute, and you can also pass in like colors and labels and things like that. And like you could take this, someone doesn't even have to know that much. I mean, they don't have to know anything about JavaScript, and they can take this and they can just like build their own dashboard, and that's really cool. And I started also thinking like, what about just JavaScript libraries that do cool stuff and maybe aren't even that like UI focused? So there's a library called Moment.js, which is really neat. You can pass it a string of text, and it will convert that to a date. So you could be like October 31st, 1983, and it'll be like, oh, boop, here you go, here's a date object in JavaScript, which is really handy because I really hate parsing and working with dates, and it makes it a bit easier on you. So I was thinking like, could I just make a moment now tag and have it just return like a date for like right now? So that's today, right? So that's that tag. And I was like, could I nest that inside of other tags? So how about a moment now tag inside of a moment format tag? And the moment format tag, you can configure it with some tokens. But so long as the moment now tag exposes a date, the moment format tag is really happy, and then it's like, sweet, I'll format that for you. And now I kind of have this whole like interface contract thing going between moment format. Moment format's just like, hey, I need a child that has a date, so I can have another tag. I can have a moment parse tag, and I can put the string for the date right there in the tag, and it'll parse that as well and format it for me. And then I can combine all this together. I can have a moment from tag that takes the moment parse tag and the moment now tag, and it just finds the difference between those two dates. So everything you're seeing on the screen is custom elements, and I didn't write any JavaScript to make any of that visually happen. It just happens with a few tags, which is really rad. And by the way, nerd bonus points if anyone knows what that date is. So browser support for custom elements, again, it's like kind of spotty. It works in Chrome and Mobile Chrome. It works in Opera and Opera Mini. It's in development in Firefox, and I hope it lands really soon. Internet Explorer and Safari, whatever. Don't worry, we're going to show some stuff so you can use it in Internet Explorer and Safari. Imports, this is the last part. Imports allow us to load external documents into our page. So you guys remember that equation? Templates plus shadow DOM equals custom elements, and imports just gets it all in the page. It's how we package up all of our stuff. So working with an import, really easy. It uses the link tag, just like when you link CSS. It has a new relation type, so instead of link rel equals style sheet, it's link rel equals import. And then you just give it the path to some HTML file that you want to pull into your document. So what you can do is in that HTML file, you can write a bunch of script to register custom elements, and then all you have to do is link to your collection of custom elements. That is like the link that I use to pull in all the charts that make my data viz example, and then you just use them. And that's it. There is no checking to see if it's loaded. There's no like async callback thing happening. You just link to it, and like CSS, you assume it's there, and you just go use your tags, which is really awesome. Browser support, though, not so awesome. It works in Chrome and Mobile Chrome behind a flag, like if you enable an option in About Flags. It does not work in Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Mobile, whatever. But we'll show you how you can use it. So that covers templates, shadow DOM, custom elements, imports. These are the 4 technologies which collectively make up the component model of the web. Now, I've shown you a bunch of stuff, and you're probably like, hey, that's really awesome for people who use Chrome Canary, which is no one. But if you want to experiment with it, definitely open up Chrome Canary and go to About Flags, turn on these options, okay? But I want to show you guys how to use them today, like right now. So we're going to talk about Polymer a little bit. Got about 10 minutes left, so I might fly through this. But Polymer is a library from the geniuses at Google. There is a similar library called Xtags by Mozilla, which is also really awesome, but I had to pick between the two, and I chose to speak about Polymer today, but definitely after the talk, go look at Xtags. So Polymer is a collection of polyfills which let us use web components in all modern browsers today. And polyfill, if you don't know what that is, it's basically some JavaScript that sneaks in support for a really cool feature in older browsers or browsers that maybe don't support that particular feature. Now, if Polymer was only a collection of polyfills which let us use web components, like if that was all it did, that would be really cool, right? But it's also a framework for building web applications with web components. And so not only does it give us all of the technologies I was showing before, it also gives us support for web animations, pointer events, template binding, node bind, and model-driven views. So we get all this extra sugar on top of support for web components in unsupported browsers. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. To work with Polymer, you just need to load the Polymer script into your page. And then you can define an element. You can do it declaratively because Polymer has kind of worked around some of the issues that the element tag had. So you can actually do a declarative version of your element, and you just need to give it a name. And then you can put a template inside of this Polymer element tag. And Polymer is smart enough to know that if there's a template inside of a Polymer element tag, that you probably want that in the shadow DOM. So it'll just go and put it in the shadow DOM for you, so you don't have to write any JavaScript. And then you just need to call the Polymer constructor. You pass it your element name again, and then you're ready to rock. And you can use your element. So that guy down there is the little Polymer element that I made that's just using that template. Now, there's a lot more that you can do with Polymer. You can also create an attributes object when you're declaring your elements. Or sorry, an attributes attribute when you're declaring your element. And you can bind to the value of that attribute. So inside of your template, you can say, my favorite color is, and then I'm using curly brace syntax to bind to the value of that attribute. And then when I call the Polymer constructor, I pass in the tag name, and I can also pass in a second argument, which is the prototype for my element. And so I can go ahead and default this color property to orange. So if the user doesn't put anything in there, it's going to say my favorite color is orange. But since the user is using the tag and they're saying that their favorite color is purple, it just magically makes it all happen, and we get the proper display. And we don't have to write any glue code to make that work. That just works. Another cool thing about these bindings is that they are like totally live. So if anything changes on that attribute, it's going to change in our prototype. It's going to change in the model for our template, or sorry, for our element. So in this example, we got a template, and we've got a span inside of this where we're going to bind the background color as well as the text content of this span to that color property, color attribute, sorry. And then down there, we're also going to have an input field where we are going to bind the value of the input field to that color property. And we go and we call our Polymer constructor. We pass in our tag name. We give it a default for the attribute. And what's really cool is we can then go down here, and as we type, it's just going to live update. And if you're used to something like Angular, maybe this like starts to feel kind of familiar, right? Because I'm not writing any glue code, and everything's just sort of like happening inside of my element, which I think is really cool. By the way, my favorite color is lawn green. That's my favorite. It's the most vivid, I think. So there's a whole lot of stuff that I didn't cover in this talk. There's a lot about Shadow DOM that we did not have time to talk about. There's a lot about Polymer that we did not have time to talk about. So for your further education, after the talk, please, I'll post the slides and go to all of these links. The first one, Web Components Resources, is a site put together by Eric Beidelman from Google. It's kind of like the one-stop shop for all things web components. So every talk and article out there written about them is all on that one page, which is really handy when you're trying to learn it. Also, check out the HTML5 Rocks section on web components. They've done a really wonderful job. Check out Polymer. Check out Xtags by Mozilla. Check out Brick, which is a whole like UI library of custom elements that have already been created by the team at Mozilla using Brick. Check out Custom Elements.io. It's this really cool like registry of custom elements that are already out there. So if you want to start using Polymer, then there's a bunch of components you can just drop in to your experiments right now. Dropbox and Google Maps and Google Analytics support, like all this stuff. And finally, keep an eye on the Chromium dashboard because that's where the progress for all of the different standards is going to be updated. And they not only follow the progress in Chrome, but they also follow the status of all the different technologies in Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Safari. So thank you guys so much. I hope that you enjoyed this sort of crazy journey down the future of the web, and I hope that you're leaving here as inspired as I am about where all this is headed and what our jobs are going to look like in the next few years. I really think that this is going to change how we build our applications, change the way that we write our libraries, and I think it's going to make all of our lives a lot better. So thank you. I think we have time for 4 minutes for questions, if anyone has questions. Yeah. So all the standards that we were showing, oh, sorry. So the question was, are any of the technologies we were showing, are any of those like wedded to the W3C? Are those W3C standards that are being worked on, right? So all the specs that we showed are current like draft proposals in the W3C. And they're all being worked on, edited by the W3C. So everything up there is community effort from all the different browser makers. Yeah. Yeah, please. Microphone it up.
Hey.
Hey.
Do I have to wait for the JavaScript to fully download in order to use web components, or can I send down a purely server-rendered page?
So if you use a link tag to import custom elements, typically you put that like in the head of your document. And the thing about link tags is that they kind of block for a bit. So I think like script tags, they block like the rest of the page from like rendering and executing. So yes, you are going to have to wait for that to happen. You can put it at the bottom of the document. And what it's going to do then is when the browser sees a custom element, it's going to like hold on to it for a second. And then when it finally registers, it's going to do this process called upgrade, where it's going to go back and like fill them all in for you. So there might be like a flash of unstyled content.
But I can't like use the shadow DOM from a static page, like no JavaScript running at all.
Use the shadow DOM for a static page with no JavaScript in it?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I follow quite what you're saying.
Well, there's like benefits to having like style encapsulation, right? I can't use that without like calling create shadow root.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, you've got to call create shadow root to like declare. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. Yeah.
The Polymer JS code that you showed, the markup for that, does it also work if I am pulling it from the server and just putting it as an inner HTML of a div or something?
For which element? For which part?
For the Polymer code that you're showing, the markup.
Right. I believe you can pull all of that from the server and just, I mean, you have to have that entire like Polymer tag on your page somewhere. And it has to come after the Polymer script has loaded, like the Polymer JS file. But however you get it on the document, Polymer will upgrade it. Like it'll just sort of, the way Polymer works is that element will just sort of fade in like when it's finally been registered.
No, I mean the tag itself, the container, the Polymer, the base tag. If I want to pull that in as a part of a markup, will that work?
Oh, yeah. So the custom element that you define, or like, yeah, all of that will work. You can pull all of that in. Yeah. Cool. Anybody else? Are you guys good? Thanks.